Well, last time we focused on the Hebrew text of the Bible, that the standard text that's come down to us, known as the Masoretic text, that's used by in synagogues. It's the text that biblical scholars refer to. It's the text that biblical translators use in translating the Hebrew Scriptures. Tonight, though, I want to move beyond and talk about how the Hebrew Bible found a place in other languages, was translated in the ancient world into a variety of languages. For people Jews who had lost their facility in Hebrew, and for non-native speakers or speakers of other languages. So I want to survey how the Hebrew Bible found its way into Greek, and then into Aramaic and a late dialect of Aramaic known as Syriac, and then Latin. We won't spend any time with these other ancient languages. Coptic, which was the language of Egypt, was the latest form of Egyptian. So it was in continuity with the Egyptian we think of as from the hieroglyphics, but it was the Egyptian as it was used and spoken in New Testament times and in the first centuries of the Common Era. The thing about Coptic is it's an Egyptian language, but it's written using letters of the Greek alphabet. Also, the Bible found its way into Ethiopic, ancient language of Abyssinia, and Ethiopic is still the language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Also into ancient Armenian and Georgian, the languages of the early Christian communities in the Caucasus. But before we go there, something I should have mentioned last time, but failed to do so, that in antiquity there was another version of the Bible in Hebrew, and that was the Hebrew of the Samaritan community. The Samaritans were the descendants of the northern tribes, such as Ephraim and Manasseh, that lived in the territory to the north of Jerusalem, between Jerusalem and Galilee, and were at the heart of what was once known as the northern kingdom of Israel. That was came to an end because of Assyrian invasions in the year 721 before the Common Era. And so the northern kingdom of Israel passed out of existence as a separate entity. And some of its citizens were exiled to Assyria and other places around the Middle East. And meanwhile, the Assyrians brought in other conquered peoples from elsewhere and settled them in that Samaritan territory. And from that point on, there was this discord and tension and falling out between the Samaritans, whose heritage went back to Moses, between them and the Jews. So the Samaritan community continued independently, but their Bible was the 5 books of Moses, Genesis through Deuteronomy, plus a modified version of the book of Joshua, and that was the sole extent of their scripture. They did not have books like Samuel, Kings, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and so on, but it was focused on the 5 books of Moses. So they preserved those first 5 books in Hebrew in a form that was quite independent of the form in which it was being transmitted in the kingdom of Judah in the south. And so here's an independent witness to an early form of the biblical text of those books. And it seems that the Samaritan Pentateuch, those first 5 books of the Bible in Samaritan Hebrew, preserve some very ancient readings that perhaps are superior to the ones of the Masoretic text. And this has been confirmed by material from the Dead Sea Scrolls, so that there are Dead Sea Scrolls of biblical texts that are at odds with the received Masoretic text that we talked about last week, the text that was transmitted by the tradition during the first centuries of the Common Era. It was stabilized by the Masoretic editors at Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee in the late 1st and 2nd century. But there are Samaritan readings that do not agree with those of the Masoretes, but there's Dead Sea Scroll materials that are in agreement with the Samaritan readings. So the conclusion is, that the Samaritan Pentateuch, insofar as it agrees with some Dead Sea Scroll readings, presents perhaps an earlier form of the Hebrew text of those first 5 books of the Bible. One example is a scroll of Leviticus from the Cave 11 at Qumran at the Dead Sea, where there are some readings that agree with the Samaritan version of the book of Leviticus. But tonight I want to move on and talk about how the Hebrew Bible came to be translated into other ancient languages for a wider audience. And the first and most significant of those is its translation into Greek. We hinted at this when we met 2 weeks ago, but there was a sizable Jewish community in Alexandria, Egypt, that, there were Jews in Egypt fairly early, from during the time of the Babylonian exile. There were communities of Jews that were not exiled into Babylon, but made their way to Egypt and settled there. But by the time of Alexander the Great, there was a significant Jewish presence in Alexandria. The estimate is that it numbered in the hundreds of thousands of Jews in Alexandria. Being in Alexandria in this Greek-speaking environment, Greek became their everyday language. They lost their facility in Hebrew as a language to use from day to day. The language of the marketplace was Greek. They spoke Greek at home. Hebrew was left to for religious purposes only, and little by little, the Jewish community there lost its facility in reading the Hebrew Bible. So a need arose for the Hebrew Bible to be translated into Greek. There's a tradition about how that came to be. And the source of this is an ancient document called the Letter of Erestius, and it talks about how the Greek ruler of Egypt, when he built his great library in Alexandria and wanted books from all over the known world to be in his library, He was aware of the Jewish law, the Genesis through Deuteronomy, and he wanted a copy of that in Greek for his library. And so, as the legend goes, he sent a delegation to the high priest in Jerusalem requesting some translators. And so, as the tradition was developed, the high priest appointed 6 elders from each of the 12 tribes for a total of 72, and they went to Alexandria and sat down and translated Genesis through Deuteronomy into Hebrew. Each of the translators was working independently, and they worked for 72 days. And at the end of 72 days, they got together and compared their translations, and they were identical. So, it was a work of the Spirit that produced the Greek translation of Genesis through Deuteronomy. So the legend goes. The Pentateuch was the first section translated into Greek sometime in probably the mid 3rd century BCE, in 250, 260, 250, 240 BCE. And then subsequent to that, the rest of the Hebrew Bible made its way into Greek. And so the translation process for the whole of the Hebrew Bible was probably completed by sometime in the 1st century before the Common Era. We don't have the original form of the Septuagint. We don't have those original translated texts. What we do have are later codices in Greek, and the most significant ones date from the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era. One is called Codex Cyanaticus. The reason for the name will become evident in a moment. Also the Codex Vaticanus. The name is suggestive that of the Vatican, because that's where it's housed. It's in the Vatican Library. And the Codex Alexandrinus from the 5th century. And this was originally in the library of the Orthodox Patriarch of Alexandria. Codex Cyanaticus was so named because it was discovered in the library of the ancient Greek Orthodox monastery at the base of Mount Sinai, the monastery of St. Catherine in the Sinai wilderness. And a scholar, biblical scholar, textual scholar from the University of Leipzig in Germany, visited the monastery in 1844, and he found some pages of this codex, this ancient codex in Greek of the Bible, both Testaments, the Old Testament and the New Testament combined, along with the books of the Apocrypha. And on a subsequent visit there, he was able to find some more leaves or more pages. And now the bulk of the codex is property of the British Museum. Some pages remain in Leipzig, but most of it is in Great Britain.
Why didn't they know it was there? Why did somebody from the outside come in and discover this code?
Well, it was there, and it took somebody like Tischendorf, who was one of these folks, particularly in the 19th century. There was this growing interest in antiquity on the part of Western scholars, and they began visiting monasteries and rummaging around in libraries to find, manuscripts of interest. They'd been there, but known only to the monks. And there are reports that even the monks weren't all that clear on what they had in their possession. That they, ignored some of this stuff. It was just there. It was just stuff in the library that they'd never paid that much attention to. This is a page out of that codex. This is the end of the book of Jeremiah and the beginning of the book of Lamentations. So the last few verses of Jeremiah are over here, and this here, the colophon at the end says, Jeremias, thus ends Jeremiah. And up here, the new book begins, Threnoi Jeremio, the Lamentations of Jeremiah. And the thing about these codices, they're all written in Greek capital letters, or uncials, and it wasn't until much later that biblical manuscripts were written in a mixture of upper and lowercase letters of the Greek alphabet. The translation done in Alexandria from the mid-3rd century down to the mid-1st century before the Common Era, as the Jewish community studied that and worked with that, there were those in the Jewish community, particularly as the Septuagint found its way out of Alexandria and was picked up and used in other Jewish communities around the Mediterranean basin, that some rabbinic authorities thought, well, it's good that we translated this for a wider audience, but the translators could have done a better job. That they noticed places that it seemed to be at variance with the standard Hebrew text. And so efforts began to make some corrections to bring it in line with the Hebrew text as it was being used by the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era. One of the reasons they wanted to engage in some corrective activity was that by this time, 1st century, 2nd century, the Septuagint had become the Bible for the early Christian community. And so, Christian churches were using the Septuagint as a witness to the Hebrew faith that the church embraced as well. And the New Testament writers, when they quote the Old Testament, they're quoting it from the Septuagint. And so there was this need felt to, let's engage in some corrective activity. So there are 3 individuals that stand out and who were responsible for some major corrections of the Septuagint text. Fellows by the name of Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodotion. Aquila, when he went through when he looked at the Greek text, or the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, he said, we ought to really translate this literally, sort of word by word. And so so what he came up with was a very wooden, rigid, word-by-word translation of Hebrew into Greek. But the other 2 guys were freer in translation. And so these became the principal examples of the corrected Septuagint to bring it into line with the Hebrew text as it was known in the early centuries of the Common Era. Well, in the late 2nd and into the 3rd century, there was a major figure in Eastern Christianity, a man by the name of Origen, who spent time in Alexandria, later moved to Palestine, lived in Caesarea, significant theologian for Eastern Christianity, but he was also a capable critic of texts. And he too noted that, well, maybe the Septuagint that the church is using, maybe that could be corrected or amended to bring it more in line with the Hebrew text. He respected Jewish tradition, Jewish textual scholarship, and he said, well, precedence ought to be given, to how to the Hebrew text and how it's being used in the Jewish community. And so he undertook this massive project to compare and contrast these three efforts on the part of these Jews, Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodotion, to take what they worked on with their corrections and compare them himself with the Hebrew text, and then come up with a revised text of his own in Greek. And it was a remarkable effort, where on the page it was laid out in 6 columns. The first column was, this was word by word and verse by verse. The first column had the Hebrew text in Hebrew. The second column, for the benefit of those who would read this that did not know Hebrew, he transliterated the Hebrew words of the text into letters of the Greek alphabet so that a non-Hebrew specialist could at least pronounce or attempt a pronunciation of the word, but using the familiar characters of the Greek alphabet. And then in the remaining columns, he had the corrected text of Aquila, the corrected text of Symmachus, the corrected text of Theodotion, and then his own reading, his own proposal for the Septuagint, the Greek Septuagint. And he had some little asterisks and other signs that he would, footnote. Well, this word in my text differs from how Aquila read this text or how Theodotion read this text. And so it was a massive, critical project. It was remarkable for its time. It was 50 volumes. And we don't have it anymore. We only have bits and pieces of it and quotations from it in other ancient authors. But it was a massive project undertaken by this significant figure from the early church. I mentioned earlier that whenever the New Testament writers have reason to quote the Old Testament, throughout the New Testament we find quotations. Matthew quotes the Old Testament repeatedly. St. Paul does as well. Other authors also. When they're quoting the Old Testament, they're not quoting it. They don't have the Hebrew text in front of them because they don't know Hebrew. or some of them, most of them did not know Hebrew, but they're quoting it from the Septuagint, from the Greek translation of the Old Testament. But sometimes that makes for some problems. And one of those is the famous verse in Isaiah 7, verse 14, that where in Matthew's account of Jesus' birth, he quotes this passage from Isaiah, "Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel." But Matthew, in quoting Isaiah from the Septuagint, comes across the Greek word parthenos, which is the Greek word for virgin. Think of the Parthenon in Athens. I mean, the temple of the Virgin Athena, the same word. But in Hebrew, the Hebrew behind the Septuagint translation of Isaiah 7:14, the Hebrew word, so translated, simply means, the Hebrew word alma, simply means a young woman of marriageable age, and is not an explicit, term for a virgin. Hebrew, rather, has a different word that's explicitly means virgin, and that's Bethula, a mature girl whom no man has known. In the original context, in Isaiah 7, the context is the prophet Isaiah is speaking to King Ahaz, who was the king of Judah, and Judah was locked in an impending crisis with the Assyrians. They were under threat from the Assyrian army, and Isaiah is speaking to Ahaz about the promise of someone from the royal family who would come and deliver Judah from defeat by the Assyrians. And so the context of the words refers to an impending crisis at that time in the mid-8th century BC. When the Septuagint came to that word alma, a young woman of marriageable age in that prophecy of Isaiah, somehow the translator chose the word parthenos to render that. In retrospect, looking back on that, if we wanted to translate alma into Greek, there's another Greek word that would have been a better one, neanis, which means simply young woman or maiden. But Matthew's use of parthenos to translate alma in Hebrew has led to Christian interpretations of the passage that do not reflect at all the original use or context of that passage in Isaiah. And so starting with Matthew and subsequent to that, the Septuagint's use of that word has made for some interpretive problems. The Septuagint, though, is useful in text criticism of the Hebrew Bible. On our first meeting 2 weeks ago, I talked about scribal errors, and one of those I mentioned is haplography, which refers to the loss of a section of text. Envisioning that the scribe, as his eyes are moving back and forth between the text he's copying and his copy, the page that he's copying himself, he sees a phrase, writes it, his eyes go back up, and often he finds another phrase, begins the same way as the first phrase, and so he thinks that's where he left off, but really he skipped over a block of material, and has completely ignored something in the middle. And so some examples of that, there's a verse in 1 Samuel 3, and Samuel slept until the morning. The Hebrew text says, and Samuel slept until the morning and opened the doors. So if you're reading the Hebrew Bible, Samuel slept until morning and he opened the doors. But the Septuagint for the same verse reads, and Samuel slept until the morning and he got up in the morning and opened the doors, which makes more sense. That somehow, the scribe had just skipped over that clause. Another one, 1 Samuel 12, when Jacob came to Egypt, and your fathers cried to the Lord. That's what it says in Hebrew. But in the Septuagint, the Greek reads, when Jacob and his sons came to Egypt, the Egyptians afflicted them, and your fathers cried to the Lord. And so that reads is a more satisfactory reading, that somewhere along the line, a Hebrew scribe simply missed some words when he was copying the text. There are some other examples of where the Greek Septuagint is helpful in reconstructing what we think might be the original. And some instances of that are in the book of Jeremiah. The text in Hebrew that we have of Jeremiah, the Masoretic text, is a more expansive or longer text. But the Hebrew text that the Septuagint was translating from of Jeremiah was a shorter text, a more condensed text. And so the original of Jeremiah seems to have been that shorter text that somewhere along the line scribes expanded or glossed on, added to, amended, and that this happened has now been confirmed by some evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls, so that there's copies of Jeremiah, fragments of Jeremiah from the fourth cave at the fourth Dead Sea's cave that witness to a shorter text of Jeremiah. In other words, a text that would have been like that the Septuagint translator was using when he translated Jeremiah. So the Septuagint still has a value to biblical scholars in understanding the text of the Hebrew Bible. The second significant translation of the Hebrew Bible into another ancient language were the translations made into Aramaic. Aramaic is a cognate language to Hebrew. We might think of the relationship between Spanish and Italian, or German and Dutch, something like that. So they're both Semitic languages, but they're more than, Aramaic is more than a dialect of Hebrew. They're separate languages, but they're quite related. They come from the same language family. When the Jews were in Babylon in exile, by then the Babylonians were using Aramaic as their everyday language. Earlier, the Babylonians had their own distinctive language called Akkadian, but as time went by, that was supplanted by Aramaic. and especially the Babylonians in administering their empire after the conquest of Palestine. They and the Persians that followed them used Aramaic as a language of diplomacy and commerce, and so they ruled their subject peoples to the west using the Aramaic language. So while the Jews were in exile in Babylon, they began to use Aramaic as well as their daily language, and Hebrew was reserved for strictly purposes of worship and scripture study and so on, just as was later the case with Alexandria and the adoption of Greek by the Jewish community there. 2 weeks ago, we made reference to Ezra, the first sort of the prototype of the scribe, and this story about Ezra with the community of Jews after they'd returned to Jerusalem, that outside one of the gates into the temple compound, Ezra stood there before the congregation and read from the book of the law, in other words, from the book of Moses. And this ritual reading from morning to midday, as he did this, as they gave the reading in Hebrew, he had standing next to him, a group of Levites, religious scholars. And it says, the text in Nehemiah 8 says that they helped the people to understand the law. In other words, Ezra's reading this in Hebrew, but these Levites are offering a commentary or a paraphrase of what Ezra's reading in a language that the people could understand. And the inference is they were doing this in Aramaic, that Ezra's reading this in Hebrew because it was, it's a sacred language. This is the language of the text. But, many in that congregation, couldn't understand it. So the services of the Levites are solicited to help the people understand the law, and so they read from the book, from the law of God, with interpretation. So the Levites are giving commentary, and here again the suggestion is that they were doing this not in Hebrew, but in the Aramaic language. As the years went by, those ad hoc paraphrases of Hebrew scripture in Aramaic, done orally, began to be written down. And the written product to the written product is given the name Targum, which in Aramaic means interpretation. We now have Targums from as early as the Dead Sea Scroll material. There are fragments of Targums dating between the second century BC and the 1st century of the Common Era. There are parts of Targums on Leviticus and Job. And then later on, into the Common Era, we have Targums that were produced by the Jewish communities both in Palestine and in Babylon. Two significant written Targums of those early centuries of the Common Era. One of the Pentateuch of Genesis through Deuteronomy, called Targum Onkelos, was prepared in Babylon. Another one, Targum Jonathan, from 1st century Palestine, but later was revised in the 4th century in Babylon. So let's look at an example of what the Targum does with a text from Exodus. Exodus 34:26 reads, based on the Hebrew text, "You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk." Now, that's one of the dietary laws. But one of these Targums in Aramaic expands upon that and says, "You shall not boil and you shall not eat flesh with milk mixed together." In other words, it expands the law, the interpretation of the law, to include all instances of mixing the eating of meat with the eating of dairy products. And so there's this, interpretive process that's going. So it's not merely a word-for-word translation that's taking place from Hebrew into Aramaic, but it's interpretive as well. There's some expansion of the text reflecting this evolution of rabbinic dietary laws. The Syriac language is a dialect of Aramaic, a later dialect of Aramaic, as it was spoken and used by early Christians in what would now be Syria, southern Turkey, and east into Iraq and what would now be Iran. So this is the language of that group of Eastern Christians, those early Christians that did not use Greek, but used Syriac because that was their everyday language. Well, they wanted the Bible, both Testaments, into their language, into Syriac. So in terms of the Hebrew Scriptures, the first translations into Syriac were made in the 1st and 2nd century of the Common Era, from within the Syrian Christian community itself. But Syrian Christians were well aware that their Jewish neighbors were using Aramaic and had versions of Hebrew Scripture in Aramaic, these so-called Targums. And so it's believed that the Syriac translation of the Old Testament, in part, simply adopts or takes over material from these Jewish Targums on the books of the Hebrew Bible. The translation came to be known as the Peshitta, which in Syriac simply means the simple or the obvious. In other words, it's the common everyday language translation of the Scripture into a language that community used on a daily basis. By the time those Syrian Christians are translating the Bible into Syriac, the Hebrew text had been pretty well established, the Masoretic text, and so for text-critical purposes, the Syriac Old Testament is not all that significant a resource because it reads pretty close, almost virtually the same as the Masoretic Hebrew Bible. The Syriac Bible, in terms of the New Testament, we'll talk about this a little bit next week, though, is a useful resource for text-critical problems or interpretive problems in reading the Greek New Testament. The last significant ancient language into which the Hebrew Bible was translated would be one more familiar to us, and that was the translation into Latin. And it was a comparable situation, a couple hundred years later, but comparable to what had happened during the conquest of Alexander the Great. as Alexander's armies marched across the Middle East, brought Greek language with them, and this populations that they had absorbed under Greek and Macedonian rule. Those populations adopted Greek as their everyday language. The same was true then later with Latin, as Rome continued to take over and dominate the Mediterranean basin. Latin followed it as became the everyday language adopted by subject peoples. And so the same thing happened, that the early Christian communities around the Mediterranean basin who had been using Greek began to feel the need to have the Bible rather in Latin. So the first examples of the Hebrew Bible in Latin date from about the 2nd century of the Common Era. But these are translations of the Old Testament made not from Hebrew, but simply made from the Greek Septuagint. Since the early Christian community was using Greek, had the Greek Septuagint as the Old Testament, that was the starting point. Well, we'll just translate what's in Greek into the Latin language. And so biblical scholars refer to those early translations into Latin simply as the Old Latin or Vetus Latina translations. The figure that emerges and becomes we could say, the second great figure from the ancient church in terms of biblical scholarship and biblical translation. The first was that man by the name of Origen that took on this massive project of comparing and contrasting all those various translations into Greek back in the early 3rd century. After him, St. Jerome emerges as this great biblical scholar and translator from the early church. We know a lot about Jerome. His life is fairly well documented. He was born in Dalmatia, to the east of the Adriatic. Probably, one guess is probably somewhere in the present country of Slovenia. He was schooled, did his early training in that area, in Aquileia, and then later in Rome. He was schooled in the Greek and Latin classics, Virgil and Homer and all of the great Greek and Latin writers of antiquity. He became a friend of a man named Damasus, who at the time was a deacon in the Western Church. Damasus would later rise through the ranks to become pope. But Jerome took up the life of a hermit, a monastic, first in the Syrian wilderness east of Antioch, and then later lived in Palestine in a monastic setting there. And the remarkable thing about Jerome is that he's well schooled in Greek. He certainly, we could even say he knew the Greek Bible by heart, if you will. But he began to study with Jews and learned Hebrew. And he became convinced that the Christian church, when it uses the Old Testament, it ought to follow the traditions of the understandings of the Old Testament that come from the Jewish community. In other words, the recourse always ought to be to the Hebrew text of the Bible. Feeling that the original Hebrew was superior to this later translation into Greek. Well, along the way, Jerome was invited by his old friend Damasus, who now was Pope, because of Jerome's linguistic skills. The Pope asked Jerome to make some revision to the Old Latin Gospels, to bring the Old Latin Gospel text in closer alignment with the Greek New Testament as it was known. But that was just a starting point. I mean, Jerome, he did that, but he went beyond that and began a translation project to bring all of the Bible, both Old and New Testaments, into the Latin language. And in so doing, he made it a priority to translate from the Hebrew Bible when it comes to the Old Testament. It took him 22 years to translate the Bible fully into Latin. And some Renaissance era artists, it's a theme in some of their artwork, such as this woodcut by Albrecht Dürer of Jerome in his study. And there are some other Renaissance paintings with similar depictions of
There's always a skull next to him in those paintings.
Pardon?
Well, there's always a skull next to him in like half of them. Why is there a skull there? Because on Wikipedia there are like 3 at the top.
Yeah. This is just, it's off the top of my head, but it was introduced as a reminder of our mortality or something like that. Down, it's sort of cut off when I tried to scan this, but down here, this is a theme that's also in some other Renaissance paintings. There's a lion lying at his feet. And there's a legend about one day when Jerome was lecturing to his students in Bethlehem, a lion limped in and had a thorn in its paw. And so Jerome stopped everything he was doing, pulled the thorn out of the lion's paw, and the lion peacefully took up residence with Jerome. But Jerome's translation came to be known as the Vulgate, from the Latin word that means common or everyday. Same word that we get English word vulgar from. The common translation, that common everyday language that was in use in the Western world. The fact that he was translating the Old Testament, not from the Septuagint, but from the Hebrew Bible, got him into trouble. And it goes back to this idea that those 72 translators were inspired by the Holy Spirit to translate from Hebrew into Greek, and that had become the Bible, the Old Testament, for the Christian church, and that was you couldn't tinker with that or tamper with that. So Jerome is accused of doing this radical thing, translating the Bible into Latin from Hebrew and not from Greek. It's sort of like back at the time, maybe you remember this, that when in the late 1940s, early 1950s, when the Revised Standard Version came out of the Bible, there was a big flap about that. How can you tamper with the King James Version of the Bible? God dictated the King James Version, and these translators, or revisers that came up with the RSV, came under criticism for altering what God had dictated. The oldest surviving manuscript of Jerome's Vulgate comes from the 8th century in a codex called Amiatinus. It was copied by monks in a monastery in Northumbria in the British Isles. It eventually made its way back to Tuscany, and today it's, I believe it's in a library or museum in the city of Florence. Jerome's Vulgate, gained popularity and became the standard Bible for Western Christianity, for the Roman Church, and was officially made so by action of the Council of Trent in the year 1546. Well, I want to shift gears from how the Hebrew Bible found its way into other ancient languages, starting with Greek and then into Aramaic and Syriac, and finally into Latin. I'm going to like to shift from that to a new topic, and that's about this amazing story, to me at least, of the discovery of the lost Hebrew text of the book of Sirach, one of the books of the Old Testament Apocrypha. Sirach, and on the Sunday mornings, every once in a while, if you're attentive, the first lesson or the first reading, occasionally, is a reading from the book of Sirach. Sirach is a wisdom book. It's, in large part, reads like the book of Proverbs. It stands in that tradition. But it's come down to us in Greek. It was fairly early on. The Greek text of Sirach was taken up and sort of absorbed into the Septuagint. Probably maybe as early as sometime in the late 2nd century, early 1st century BC. And then it was also translated subsequently into Latin and Syriac. So those are the only texts that we have at our disposal of the book of Sirach are in Greek, Latin, and Syriac, although it is known that it was originally written in Hebrew, because the fellow who translated it from Hebrew into Greek tells us so. The translator was the author's grandson, who translates the Hebrew text of Sirach around the year 132 BC in Alexandria, translates from a Hebrew text of his grandfather's Hebrew text into Greek, so that this book could be made available to the Jewish community in Alexandria. So we know it was in Hebrew, but we don't have it. The Hebrew text was thought to have been lost, forever. And the general thinking was that, well, since the book of Sirach was finally deemed not canonical by the rabbis, that the Hebrew text of Sirach in the Jewish community simply fell into disuse, or may have been even suppressed by rabbinic authorities or something of the kind. So for centuries, the church, using, insofar as it uses the Apocrypha, only had the book of Sirach in Greek and in Latin and Syriac. But all of that began to change in 1896. But before we go there, just a couple of facts about Syriac. It's the longest book in the Old Testament Apocrypha. It's 51 chapters long. So it's a comparable length to the book of Isaiah or Jeremiah. It's far longer than the book of Proverbs, although its style is much like the book of Proverbs. The proper Hebrew title for the book would have been The Wisdom of Jesus, the Son of Sirach. And in Greek, the Greek translation is simply called The Wisdom of Sirach. But in the Latin Bible tradition, it assumed the name Ecclesiasticus. Not Ecclesiastes, but Ecclesiasticus, the church book, insofar as it was used by the Latin church for readings in worship. And so in the King James Bible of 1611, the title of the book at the top of the page, you'll still find the title Ecclesiasticus. It's an interesting book in that the author, this Sirach, himself was a scribe. He operated a scribal school, a school of house of study, where he taught his students the law and the prophets, but also wisdom traditions, such as those of the book of Proverbs, and wisdom traditions that were imported from other ancient cultures. He was a devoted and pious Jew, had a great respect for the temple and for the priesthood, but he was sort of cosmopolitan for his day. He traveled widely and had significant knowledge of Greek literature and Greek traditions as well. But since 1896, things have happened that we've been able to recover the text of Sirach in Hebrew. Let's start with number 3, medieval Hebrew manuscripts from the Benezer Synagogue in Cairo. This is what happened in 1896. And we'll come back to this in a moment. But the discovery in an old synagogue in Cairo, discovery made there in part, first by one of the books on the reading list is this book, The Sisters of Sinai. These two Victorian-era Scottish Presbyterian women who traveled widely in the Middle East and began rummaging around, finding manuscripts, were largely self-taught in ancient languages. And in their travels, from an antiquities dealer, they picked up a scrap of a text in Hebrew that they could not recognize. They knew it was Hebrew, but it was unfamiliar to them as to where this might have come from. Well, when they got back to Cambridge, a good friend of theirs was a professor of Jewish studies at Cambridge University, a Romanian-born rabbi by the name of Solomon Schechter. And the two sisters and Schechter became good friends. And so they said, well, maybe Solomon will know what this text is about. So they stopped by one day and gave it to him. And he read it and immediately came back to them later that day and said, I mean, this is amazing. He recognized that scrap as a text of Sirach in Hebrew. And at that time, we did not have any evidence of the original Hebrew text of Sirach. And so that set off a chain of events that Schechter, because of that, on his own, went in search of additional materials, and he ended up in Cairo and found his way to this historic medieval synagogue in Cairo. And there, in a storeroom in this old synagogue, he found additional texts of Syriac in Hebrew, along with a host of thousands of other ancient medieval Hebrew documents. So subsequent, from that synagogue storeroom, we now have much of the text of Syriac between chapters 3 and chapter 51. And then later, from the Dead Sea Scroll discoveries of the 50s and 60s, we now have some fragments of Syriac from chapter 6 and chapter 51 found at the Dead Sea. And then in the excavations at the fortress of Masada, in the late, there's a late 1st century AD manuscript of Syriac 39 through 44 in Hebrew. So the Masada discoveries, this is a photo of the fortress of Masada up on top of this mountain, about 35 miles south of Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. Fortress developed there by descendants of the Maccabees, founded about 100 BCE, later expanded by Herod the Great. And it's remembered as this site where Jewish warriors held out against the Romans in the year 72, 73 of the Common Era. But they committed, because rather than being taken captive by the Romans, they chose to commit mass suicide. And so in an excavation there in 1964 was found this manuscript of Syriac in Hebrew. This is just a photo of part of that Masada manuscript. It's taken from that book that's going around. And the date of the scroll probably is somewhere between 100 and 75 before the Common Era. But back to the Solomon Schechter story and the 1896 discovery of these medieval Hebrew manuscripts. They were found in this historic synagogue in the old medieval section of Cairo. So this synagogue dates to year 882. It's no longer a functioning synagogue. It's maintained as a museum. This is the interior. The Torah shrine would be back here. But there's a gallery on each side above, and in that gallery, off that gallery is located this storeroom, or Benezer, where it was used for the storage of scrolls and other materials that were too fragile to be used anymore. But these were documents all written in Hebrew, which is a sacred language, and you can't destroy anything written in a sacred language. It has to be kept. You can't use it anymore because it's too fragile. So in medieval synagogues, they set aside these storerooms or repositories for manuscripts no longer were usable. So in the Geniza of this Benezer synagogue, there are thousands of documents in that storeroom from the Middle Ages, and among those were these manuscripts of Syriac that Solomon Schechter was to find and to bring back to Cambridge. This is a diorama that reconstruction of the scene. This would have been up on the gallery level above the sanctuary, and the Geniza, entrance to the Geniza was up here, and it had been sealed off by these panels, and once the panels were removed and Schechter was able to find his way into there, there was a vast treasure trove of documents that he received permission from the synagogue officials to pack up and bring back to Cambridge. And they're still in Cambridge to this day and continue to be studied and evaluated in the years since. The word Geniza is simply the Aramaic word for storeroom or repository. And so this is one of those texts of Sirach in Hebrew found by Solomon Schechter starting in 1896, parts of chapters 13 and 14 that are now in the collection of Cambridge University. Well, the initial question about these Geniza manuscripts, long before the discovery of the Dead Sea material, the Masada material, early on in the early 20th century, scholars were wondering, well, these are written in medieval Hebrew. Maybe they're just retranslations. Some pious Jew decided to take the Greek text of Sirach, translate it back into Hebrew. And that, at the time that made sense. These are manuscripts from the 11th century, so these are just medieval retranslations from Greek back into Hebrew. But along the way, in the midst of all of this, about the same time the Dead Sea Scrolls were being discovered, a Franciscan biblical scholar at Catholic University of America, as his dissertation project, took on this question: are these medieval Hebrew manuscripts retranslations, or do they reflect a legitimate transmission of the Hebrew text over time from antiquity down to when they ended up in that synagogue storeroom? Well, one of the things he came across in his research was a letter written between two Syrian Orthodox bishops from the year 796, the Common Era. And so the players in this story are these two bishops, and they tell the story of, it's come to the attention of one bishop, the bishop in Jerusalem, that he was aware that an Arab shepherd had come across some texts, and it had come to his attention that these were written not in Syriac, not in our language, but these were written in Hebrew, and came to the attention of some Jewish converts to Christianity, who in turn informed him about their existence. And the letter, the one bishop to the other, says, he's talking about some general items of biblical interest, but then he says, I found out that these books had been found in a cave near Jericho. These books were in Hebrew. They weren't in Syriac. And some of these books are not in the Jewish text of the Old Testament. In other words, there's some extraneous or apocryphal material here. So this was, he thought it was significant. Now looking back, what the bishop seems to be referring to is an incident comparable to 1947. But this is back in the 8th century of the Common Era. That when that Bedouin shepherd wandered into the caves in 1947, it wasn't the first time. Some other Arab shepherd had stumbled into a cave, found some books, and the stories are mirror images of each other. That in the 8th century, this shepherd brought the books to the attention of folks in Jerusalem, and hence the report that the bishop makes about these books in Hebrew, that some of them not known to us, that it just parallels, the Caves, Dead Sea Scroll discoveries in our own time. And you look back on it, it stands to reason that why in 1947 were these discovered, and it took so long. Somebody else found some of this material earlier, and it found its way to Jerusalem, brought to the attention of a Jewish sect known as the Kerites. And these were Jews that were especially drawn to the study of Scripture. These were the scripturalists. And they, receiving these Hebrew documents out of the cave, copied them, made copies, sent them to the Kerite community, their co-religionists in Cairo, and it was from those copies that copies were made that finally ended up in this synagogue storeroom. And were there until 1896, when they were identified by Solomon Schechter. So if we put all the pieces together, those medieval Hebrew manuscripts, now the Dead Sea Scroll material from Cave 2, and this scroll from Masada, we have recovered most of the Hebrew of the book of Sirach that was thought long lost to us. Some final words about the Kerite community that was especially attentive to this material. There still are Kerite communities today in Israel, and including some in this country. I've been told that there's a Kerite synagogue in the San Francisco Bay Area somewhere. And they were sort of like the Sadducees of biblical times, that they rejected the Pharisaic idea of an oral law or oral tradition, the oral law that transmitted over time that came from Moses, but came living tradition that was passed alongside the written text of Genesis through Deuteronomy. Their name comes from the verb in Hebrew, also in Arabic, that means to read or to recite. So the Kerites are those scripturalists whose focus is exclusively on the written text of the Hebrew Bible. And the commonality of that verb in the Semitic languages, that not only in Hebrew, as the root of this word Kerite, naming that sect, but it's also picks up in Arabic the command that by tradition, the command that the angel Gabriel gave to Muhammad, to read or to recite, take down and recite the revelation and the very words of God. And so the Quran, the name for the Muslim holy book, is from the same root. So the Quran simply means that which is recited or that which is read. All the same verb. So among the books that I listed on that initial handout, 3 of those touch upon those Genesic manuscript discoveries in some way. This book on the Sisters of Sinai, as well as this one by a rabbi by the name of Mark Glickman, Sacred Treasure, the Cairo Geniza, and this one, Sacred Trash, the Lost and Found World of the Cairo Geniza. And both of these, along with the Sisters of Sinai, are well done and informative, and are easy to read. I mean, they're just good reads and not heavily academic, but are solid in their telling of the story. Well, we're at our time to adjourn, but next week, when we meet for the last time in the series, we'll focus on the New Testament, on the Greek New Testament from its origins in the 1st century and early 2nd century, and how the Greek text of the New Testament has come down over the years to us today and is reflected in modern translations of the Gospels, St. Paul, and the other books of the early Christian community. Any questions? Comments?
I can recommend the Travels of the Two Sisters. It's fantastic. It's absolutely gripping. Somebody asked, why was it that they didn't find this? Why didn't they just go and get it? The travel involved to the Sinai, the permissions that they had to get in order to enter this monastery of the monks of St. Catherine's. It's just then sitting on a camel for 10 to 20 days, riding a camel. Half of the time they just walked because the camel became such a
they had to put together these expeditions. They had to secure a person to put the package together for them, a dragoman, and give him the money to get what he needed, and he in turn got camels and drivers and provisions and tents and all the supplies they needed, and they'd set off across the desert in a multi-day expedition to reach St. Catherine's Monastery. And this is during a time that it's all part of the Ottoman Empire, and so you're dealing with Turkish authorities and all of that, and it was a major undertaking. And the remarkable thing about these 2 women, I think I mentioned this earlier, but they were largely self-taught in ancient languages, Greek, and when they found these, we'll mention it next week, but when they found these Syriac manuscripts, one of them in particular saw this as an occasion to learn Syriac. She learned Syriac so she could read what she had found. And this was at a time when they became credible scholars in their own right, in terms of their competence and skills they had acquired. But this was at a time when the University of Cambridge, did not have women students. But they had otherwise they had all the qualifications that they could have been on the Cambridge divinity faculty in the ancient languages, but they were women, and so in the late 1800s you just didn't do that. Well, thank you. See you next week.